although it might not look like it to people on the outside, it feels like we're in a strange bear market. There's a very small handful of assets that are holding up and staying close to their highs. But if you look at the broader market of tokens, which have traditionally performed well or been more correlated to Bitcoin, there's huge underperformances. We've seen huge down moves. And within this space, I feel that there's a bear market within a market, if that makes sense.
Are we in a strange bear market? Our next guest says when we look outside the major market cap tokens, we see a different story. Founder of Avant-Garde Finance and Enzyme, Mona El Issa, joins the show now to unpack this more. Mona, welcome to Markets Daily.
Thanks for having me, Jen.
What are you watching this morning?
Well, every time I turn on my sort of coinmarket.com lately, it's more or less flat. So I don't think a lot has been happening recently, other than in a couple of assets that are being singled out, really. It feels to me like the market is trading very sideways. And although it might not look like it to people on the outside, it feels like we're in a strange bear market. So what do I mean by that? There's a very small handful of assets that are holding up and staying close to their highs. But if you look at the broader market of tokens, which have traditionally performed well or been more correlated to Bitcoin, there's huge underperformances. We've seen huge down moves, and within this space, I feel that there's a bear market within a market, if that makes sense. So on some of those kind of smaller, medium-sized tokens, and I'm turning my focus a little bit more towards that, because you're starting to see some tokens trading at ridiculously low market caps. And when you take a zoom in on some of the projects, we've been doing some digging into some of these projects. They're not your they're actually legitimate projects that have been around for 7, 8, 9 years. They're generating serious amounts of revenue, and they're just trading at ridiculously low market caps. So, obviously it's interesting to spot these opportunities and identify them and sort of dip in if it makes sense.
Is there a particular project you're watching or particular crypto that you think is trading much lower than its value and that investors should be watching right now?
Well, the one that I'm slightly obsessed about, and this is no secret, we like it a lot as a firm, so disclaiming that here. But the one that I'm sort of obsessive about at the moment is PowerSwap. So if you don't know PowerSwap is one of the top 3 DEX aggregators by volume. They generated last month $400,000 in fees, and they are trading that's annualizing at $5 million per year, and their market cap is around $20 million now, fully diluted. So, when you look at that and you look at some of the valuations other similar protocols are trading at, or so other market cap, fee to market cap ratios of other similar protocols, that looks like very deep relative value to me.
You said we're in a strange bear market. Curious to hear your thoughts on why you think that is. Is that because of what's going on in the macro landscape? Is it because of what's going on when it comes to global economic policy? And what needs to happen to get us out of this strange bear market?
That's a really good question. So when I say strange, I mean, Bitcoin is still flirting with its all-time highs. I mean, we're not quite there, but we're very close. But when you look at other, tokens of pretty high profile projects in the DeFi space, for example, they're sort of 80, 90% off their highs. So that's creating a lot of pain in the space, which isn't headlined, because usually when people talk about the market, they're looking at Bitcoin or Solana or Ripple. But when you actually look at some of the projects in the ecosystem, they're really struggling. And that doesn't get talked about as much. But that also, in past bear markets, when Bitcoin is down, everything else is down. When Bitcoin is up, everything else is up, generally speaking, right? And that's why I characterize it as a strange bear market, because we're sort of having a dislocation between Bitcoin. You sort of asked why. I can only guess, but I would imagine that the US political landscape has obviously, encouraged a lot of people, or in some people's minds, it's de-risked crypto a lot. But if you're a large institution who's never touched crypto before, and suddenly you're like, okay, Trump is pro crypto, one of the first assets you're going to buy is Bitcoin because it's the one you're not going to get fired for. It's the obvious one to buy and similar to the other top 3, 5 tokens and most liquid tokens. So it kind of makes sense. And I suppose it's a characteristic of new money coming in, potentially not fully understanding the full ecosystem yet. But I guess we will get there as investors mature and start to look at the space more broadly. You will see, some of the sort of small mid caps catch up. And also if they don't, then it's a huge M&A opportunity.
I want to talk about M&As in just a second, but let's dig a little bit more into DeFi. I've had some guests come on the show recently and said, don't be surprised if we see another DeFi summer on the horizon. Just talk to me a little bit about what you're watching from a DeFi perspective and how you expect DeFi to perform as the year goes on.
Yeah, DeFi is it's really interesting because there's a couple of things to unpick here. So you may have seen, I think it was yesterday or the day before, there was some article or note about stablecoin TVL being the largest it's ever been in DeFi. And one of the reasons for that is also because the market has been moving sideways for a few months. So if the market's moving sideways, or if your tokens or tokens in general are moving down and people are afraid that their token will go down, they want to diversify and move into stablecoin. But why hold stablecoin if you can be earning yield on stablecoin in DeFi? And so there's a lot of supply in lending protocols, and there's a lot of attempts in DeFi to generate yield on stablecoin. We're actually on the avant-garde finance side seeing the most inflows ever in our history in our stable yield coin products. But what is interesting is that traditionally in bear markets, DeFi yield tends to become uncorrelated to treasury yield. In this case, we haven't seen that yet. DeFi yield and treasury yields are more or less on par. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because generally speaking, markets are moving sideways, so there's not a huge demand for leverage. Arbitrage opportunities maybe are lower because there's not as much liquidity. It could be a number of reasons, but interestingly, we haven't seen that dislocation or lack of correlation yet.
There's always this kind of underlying narrative driving the industry at any given moment. And right now, I feel like one of them is this narrative around real world assets. And I'm just curious to hear what your perspective is on real world assets. I know that total value locked has exceeded $10 billion. There really is this drive for DeFi infrastructure to solve a lot of the problems that we see in CeFi to get these real world assets on chain. What's your perspective on this convergence of CeFi and DeFi, and will that ultimately help the DeFi ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's happening. You're seeing a lot of real world assets. They do have different come to market, as you said, like there's no lack of TVL there, but they do have, in many cases, different characteristics because they are securities, or they're classified as securities, which means people, generally speaking, have to KYC AML before they get into them. It means that the underlying tokens are non-transferable. And so by definition, they're not as composable with the rest of DeFi as DeFi, as non-security tokens. So that poses a bit of a challenge to the composability and to the two worlds becoming fully integrated. But as that gets resolved, the two worlds definitely will continue to converge more and more. And one way that we've tackled that is we became the first on-chain asset manager to become regulated. It was nearly 2 years ago now. and that enables us to do a mixture of both. But I think we're one of the few players to be able to do that, to do both of those things at once. But again, we also have to KYC our investors into those products, etc. So it's not open to the masses, and that until it is, or until there's some legislation that um, puts securities and DeFi tokens on par with one another, it will be difficult to unlock that full that those two worlds fully coming together.
I want to come back to something you said earlier, which was that M&A is increasing in crypto. I think about the last time M&As kind of dominated the headlines was in the last bull market, really. And you mentioned we're in a strange bull market. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of M&A and how we make sense of that against, I guess, what we're seeing happening in the crypto markets.
Yeah, it's a little bit like politics. It's becoming more and more polarized. There's people who are doing really well and people who are not doing very well at all, and because of that, there is definitely fire to do M&A. Just in the last few months alone, we've seen Cantor Equity acquire 21 Capital. We've seen Kraken acquire NinjaTrader. We've seen Ripple recently acquire Hidden Road, and Stripe acquire Bridge. I mean, this is just a few. Like, there's dozens of M&A, activity in the equity world, and that's because there's a lot of good partly because some of these companies want to grow faster, but don't have the expertise in house. So partly it's strategic, and sometimes in some cases they're willing to pay very high multiples just to save a year or two of building out that functionality and that skill base themselves. And in other cases, it's because assets are distressed. And I think where you'll see that more and more is in the token world, where assets are super distressed. Not all of them, obviously, but some assets are becoming quite distressed or very cheap. And from a strategic perspective, or just a pure kind of financial perspective, it becomes very interesting to pursue a roll-up strategy to increase your revenue and your broaden your sort of target market, and it hasn't really been done in so far. Enzyme actually acquired a majority stake in MISO Finance, an options protocol, in December last year. But other than that, I haven't seen it done a lot. But I think it's something that will really increase this year if we don't see, or if we continue to see, depressed valuations in revenue generating protocols.
We saw in the headlines last year, and I really am just asking for your opinion here, that Ripple has made a bid for Circle. I'm wondering if you're able to kind of make sense of that for our audience. What does it tell us when Ripple, this company that has really been fighting for the space, that has been successful in fighting for the space for so long, creating a name, creating a community for itself, goes to acquire another huge company that's operating in a different, I guess, realm of the crypto markets? What does that tell you when we start to develop narratives about where we're going, where we're going to see mainstream adoption?
I think it tells you that a lot of these bigger companies have maybe stopped growing as much as they were like 5-6 years ago, and therefore they're looking for the next leg of growth. And rather than building out that functionality or skill set themselves, they can just acquire that growth through M&A. And I think that's, if I were to guess, like, a lot of the deal terms and stuff are not public, but if I were to guess, I would say that that's a large reason. People are thinking, is the revenue that I'm making sustainable? Am I still going to be able to grow at this rate in 5 years? And if not, what do I need to do to continue to grow at this rate? And sometimes the answer will be, well, I need to grow horizontally or vertically so that I can, my customers can become more sticky, or I can cross-sell products to my clients or whatever. And therefore, as the result of this realization, it becomes strategically and interesting to purchase assets in this market.
Mona, thanks so much for joining Markets Daily today. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure too. Thanks for having me, Jen.